Which has been the most powerful intelligence agency in history?
The most powerful intelligence agency in history. I mean, it's an interesting question. I'd say probably in terms of historical longevity and consistency of performance, that the Russian intelligence services, notice I didn't say the KGB specifically, but the Russian intelligence services, going back to the Tsarist period, are consistently pretty good. Not infallible. None of them are. Of course, there's a common Western way of looking at anything Russian. Very often, I think this is still the case, Russians are viewed in one of two ways. Either they are bumbling idiots or they are diabolically clever. There's no sort of middle ground. And you can find both of those examples in this. So what I mean by that is that if you're looking at the modern SVR or FSB, which are just two different organizations that used to be part of the one big KGB, or the KGB or its predecessors, the Cheka, you're really going back to the late 19th century and the Imperial Russian Intelligence Security Service, generally known as the Okhrana or Okranka. It's really the Department of Police and the Special Corps of Gendarmes. Their primary job was protecting the imperial regime and protecting it against imperial, or rather interior enemies, revolutionaries for the most part. And they got very, very good at that. By co-opting people within those movements, infiltrating and recruiting informers, agent provocateurs. In fact, they excelled at the agent provocateur. Person you place inside an organization to cause trouble, usually maneuver them into a position of leadership, and they provoke actions that can then allow you to crack down on them. That is, many sort of lure or bring the target organization into any legal or open status that it can be more effectively suppressed. They were very good at that. So good that by the early 20th century, in the years preceding the Russian Revolution in 1917, they had effectively infiltrated every radical party, Bolsheviks, Mensheviks, SRs, great and small, and placed people in positions of influence and leadership. To the point that arguably, that is, you can debate this, but I think in the whole, they could largely dictate what those parties did. Nothing was discussed at any central committee meeting of any revolutionary group that the Okhrana wasn't immediately aware of. And they often had people in positions to influence what those decisions were. Of course, that raises an interesting question, is that if they were that good and they had infiltrated and effectively controlled most of the opposition, then how did the regime get overthrown by revolutionaries? The answer to that is that it wasn't overthrown by revolutionaries. It was overthrown by politicians. That would then take us into a detour into Russian history, but I'll just leave it with this. If you look at 1917 and you look closely, this is one of the things I would always tell my students, is that there are two Russian revolutions in 1917. There's the first one in March or February, depending on your calendar, that overthrows Nicholas II. Revolutionaries are really not involved with that. Bolsheviks are nowhere to be seen. Trotsky and Lenin are nowhere to be seen. They have nothing to do with that. That has to do effectively with a political conspiracy within the Russian parliament, the Duma, to unseat an emperor they thought was, bungling the war and was essentially a loser to begin with. And it was a coup d'etat, a parliamentary coup d'etat. The temporary or provisional government that revolution put in power was the one overthrown by Lenin 8 months later. And that government was essentially one dominated by moderate socialists. It was a government that very quickly sort of turned to the left. The guy we associate with that is Alexander Kerensky. Alexander Kerensky was a Russian socialist, a politician. He was the quasi-dictator of that regime. He's the person, not the Tsar, who's overthrown by Lenin. So the revolutionaries then did not prove to be the fatal threat to the Tsarist regime. It was the Tsarist political system itself that did that. What then transpired was that the Okhrana and its method and many of its agents then immediately segued over into the new Soviet security service. So one of the first things that Lenin did in December of 1917, within a month of seizing power, since the hold on power was tenuous at best, was that, well, you were going to need some kind of organization to infiltrate and suppress those pesky counter-revolutionaries and foreign imperialists and all of the other enemies that we have. And so the Extraordinary Commission to Combat Counter-Revolution and Sabotage, the Cheka, was formed. You put a veteran Bolshevik, Felix Dzerzhinsky, at the head of that, someone you could politically rely upon, but Dzerzhinsky built his organization essentially out of the Okhrana. I mean, there were all of these informers sitting around with nothing to do, and they were employed. In the early 20s, the kind of rank and file of the Cheka might have been 80 to 90% former imperial officials. Those were gradually decreased over time. So why would they do that? Well, they were professionals. They also needed to eat, and things were somewhat precarious. So if your job is to be an agent provocateur, if your job is to infiltrate targeted organizations and lead them astray, you do that for whoever pays you. That's part of the professionalism which goes in. And under the Soviets, the Soviet intelligence services are also very good at that. They're very good at infiltrating people into opposing organizations. And I guess the one example I would give to demonstrate that are the Cambridge Five, the British traitors, from Soviet standpoint, heroes, who were recruited, most notably Kim Philby, Guy Burgess, Donald McLean, Anthony Blunt, and there may have been well more than five, but that wasn't bad out of just Cambridge. And then placing those people in high positions, the ultimate goal, of course, is to get your people into positions of leadership and influence in the opposing intelligence service. And so they did. Of course, it all fell apart, and they ended up in, Philby ended up living the last part of his life in exile in Moscow, but they got their money's worth out of him. And you can also find this in KGB infiltration of the CIA, the FBI, the Aldrich Ames, Robert Hansen cases. Of course, we were infiltrating. By we, I mean the Americans in the West managed to infiltrate our moles as well. But if it came down, someone could dispute this, but I would think if you were going to come down to a kind of like a who had the most moles Super Bowl, probably the Soviets would come somewhat ahead of that.
So the scale of the infiltration, the number of people, and the skill of it. Is there a case to be made that the Okhrana and the Cheka orchestrated both the components of the Russian Revolution as you described them?
Well, there's an interesting question for me. I mean, there are all kinds of questions about this. I mean, one of the questions is whether or not Lenin was an Okhrana agent. Okay, I've just said heresy. Some people, I'll do that quite often because I am a heretic and proud of it.
Great.
Why would you possibly say that Lenin could have been an Okhrana agent? Well, let's look what he managed to do. So you had, coming into the 20th century, nominally a single Marxist movement, the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party. And Bolsheviks and Mensheviks, majorityites and minorityyites, are merely factions of that party. And they always agreed that they were all Marxists, and we all believe in dialectical materialism and the rise of we're all socialist, comrade. The difference was the tactical means by which one would attain this. And what Lenin wanted was a militant, small-scale vanguard party. He wanted a revolution. He wanted to seize power, seize control of the state, and once you have the state, then you induce socialism from above. Whereas the majority of the people, the so-called Mensheviks, the minorityyites, who are, oddly enough, the vast majority of the party, that's one of the first things. How do you lose that argument? Okay, how does the minority get to grab the name majority? But Lenin did that. So what Lenin wanted was a conspiratorial party of committed revolutionaries that would plot and scheme and undermine and eventually seize control of the state and induce socialism from above. There were other Russian Marxists who thought that sounded vaguely totalitarian and not really democratic and not even terribly socialist. And they opposed that ineffectively from the beginning, outmaneuvered every step of the way. The Mensheviks are a case study in failure of a political organization. That too will be heresy to some people, but look, they lost. Now, so what Lenin managed to do, starting around 1903, continuing on to this, is he managed to divide, to take what had been a single Marxist party and split it into angry, contending factions. Because he and his Bolsheviks were on one side, advocating a much more militant conspiratorial policy. The discombobulated Mensheviks were over on the other, and in between were a lot of people who really didn't know where they stood on this. I mean, sometimes they kind of agreed, and he seems to be making sense today. No, I don't think he's making sense in that day. But he managed to completely disunify this organization. Now, who could possibly have seen benefit in that? The Ograna. Now, whether or not they put him up to it, whether or not in some way they helped move him into a position of leadership or encouraged it through people around him, whether he was a witting or unwitting agent of the Tsar's secret police, he certainly accomplished exactly what it was that they had wanted. And I find that suspicious. It's one of those things that it's so convenient in a way is that I'm not necessarily sure that was an accident. There's also this whole question to me as to what was going on within the Okrana itself. Now, this is one of these questions we might come to later about how intelligence agencies interact or serve the governments to which they are theoretically subordinate. They do tend to acquire a great deal of influence and power. After all, their main job is to collect information. And that information could be about all kinds of things, including people within the government structure itself. And they also know how to leverage that information in a way to get people to do what you want them to do. So an argument can be made, again, an argument, not a fact, merely an opinion, which is mostly what history is made out of, opinions, is that at some point between about 1900 and 1917, people within the Okrana were playing their own game. And that game took them in a direction which meant that continued loyalty to the emperor, specifically to Nicholas II, was no longer part of that. To me, in a way, it seems almost during the events of 1917 that, one, you had an organization that was very effective when it did that suddenly just becomes ineffective. Doesn't really disappear. These things don't go away because it will reappear as the Ochaka basically fairly quickly. But it raises the question to me as to what degree there were people within the organization who allowed events to take the course they wished.
I always wonder how much deliberate planning there is within an organization like Akrana, or if there's kind of a distributed intelligence that happens.
Well, one of the key elements in any kind of intelligence organization or operation is compartmentalization, need to know. So rarely do you have an occasion where everybody in an executive position are all brought into a big corporate meeting and we discuss all of the secret operations that are going on. No, you never do that. Only a very limited number of people should know about that. If you have a person who is a case officer is controlling agents, he's the only one who should know who those people are. Possibly his immediate superiors, but in no way do you want that to be common knowledge. So information within the organization itself is compartmentalized. So you don't need everybody to be in on it. You don't even need necessarily the people who are nominally at the top. For instance, the Okhrana, the real boss of the Okhrana was the Imperial Ministry of the Interior. The Minister of the Interior, in fact. But the Minister of the Interior had no real effective control over this at all. I mean, to the point was that at one point early on, they actually organized the assassination of their own boss. They have their agents among the revolutionaries kill the Minister of the Interior, because he'll just be replaced by another one. He is an imperial bureaucrat. He's not really part of their organization. You know, it's like a director of an intelligence agency appointed by the president. Maybe he's part of the organization. Maybe he isn't. Maybe he is not one of us. So you've got different levels, different compartments within it. And who's actually running the show, if anyone is, I don't know. That's never supposed to be apparent.
Well, that's a fascinating question. I mean, you could see this with NKVD. It's obviously an extremely powerful organization that starts to eat itself, where everybody's pointing fingers internally also as a way to gain more power. So the question is, in organizations like that are so compartmentalized, where's the power? Where's the center of power? Because you would think, given that much power, some individual or a group of individuals will start accumulating that power. But it seems like that's not always a trivial thing, because if you get too powerful, the snake eats that person.
Well, if we go back again to the founder of the Soviet secret police, Felix Dzerzhinsky. Dzerzhinsky dies in 1926. Keels over after giving a heated speech to a party meeting. Now, the common view, what you usually read, which was key for the time, is that, clearly Stalin had him whacked, because anytime someone died, it was almost always that. And I think a lot of times he did. But in some cases, Stalin's probably getting blamed for things that he didn't actually do. Dzerzhinsky wasn't even opposed to Stalin, so it's not clear why he would. But this was Stalin died, obviously he was poisoned, something happened. It was an unnatural death. Somebody goes in for an operation, gets a little too much anesthesia. Stalin killed them. Somebody tips over in a canoe in upstate New York. Stalin killed them. There's actually a case about that. So that itself can be kind of useful, where every time someone dies, they think you killed them. That's kind of an interesting method of intimidation in that regard. But the suspicion is nonetheless there. Dzerzhinsky he was the Grand Inquisitor. He was seemingly firmly in control of the organization. Of course, maybe he wasn't. Maybe he was. My guess would be is that if Dzerzhinsky's death was not natural causes, that he was probably eliminated by someone within his own organization. And then you look at the people who take over. His immediate successor is Vyacheslav Menzinsky, who's really not really a secret policeman, more a kind of intellectual dilettante. But if you look behind him, you'll notice the fellow is Henryk Yagoda. And Yagoda will really sort of manage things from behind the scenes until Menzinsky dies in 1934. And then Yagoda will hold on till he's a victim of the purges, I think, in 37 or 38. Yagoda is ambitious, murderous. And if I was going to point the finger to anybody who possibly had Dzerzhinsky whacked, it would be him. And for the purposes simply of advancement. That's the person to look out in any kind of corporate organization is your immediate subordinate, the person who could move into your job, because more than likely that's exactly what they're planning to do.
Yeah, just one step away from the very top.
Yeah.
Somebody there will probably accumulate the most power.